Good morning, everyone. I hope everybody is okay or relatively okay considering the circumstances that you were able to start your semester properly with online classes, with in-person classes, and first and foremost, you're making sure that keeping yourself safe. Uh, Today we'll start our first topic of discussion, what we have on the syllabus for week 2. But beforehand, I have a few programming notes, making sure that we are on the same page. So as I promised, the course website is up and running. I'm going to put a link for that on the on your eCampus account, as well as on the syllabus. So you will have the updated version of the syllabus with the link to the course website. Now, this website doesn't offer you anything that you don't already have. It's just going to make it easier to have access to the information. So it has links to the lecture slide. It already, by now, it already has the slides from last week, as well as the video itself. So if you are not able to find on your email for some reason the links to the video or to the slides, you can go to the course website and just save it wherever it is that you save your access to courses, to websites, and you're able to get it everything there. So at the moment, what you'll have there, it's going to be updated every week. At the end of the lectures, at some point, I will update the updated slides as well as the link to the video itself. And you can go and access it from there. So that's number one. The second point is regarding attendance. Starting today, we're going to start record the attendance. So I'll remind you throughout the lecture once or twice about the attendance, and I'll provide you at some point with the attendance word. So make sure that you follow that procedure as I explained on Thursday, of going into the, after you write down the attendance word and you finish watching today's lecture, go into the Google form, make sure that you write all your personal information, your full name, your UIN, today's date, as well as the attendance word, and then there shouldn't be any problem with recording your attendance for today. I will make sure during this week that everything is actually working smoothly with this method and make sure that it works and it's easy for everyone. That's going to be okay. The last point, and for that I can already share with you the slides. All right, so we have slides already in progress. The way that lectures are going to go on from today until the end of the semester pretty much is that the slides are going to be composed of the different topics of the day. Every slide begins with, every lecture begins with a slide which will be a quick review of the previous lectures and main topics. I will provide in 2 or 3 minutes of discussion just reminding you the main topics that we've talked about and making sure that you're able to relate the points of discussion from Tuesday meetings to Thursday meetings, which will be a lot more flowing in that sense. But also when you go from a Thursday meeting to a Tuesday meeting, looking back will help you also make sure that everything is organized. So that's my additional points for today, so we can just begin. I have also a review slide for today just to make sure that we are all understanding how that works. So that's how a review slide is going to look like. Last week on Thursday, which was the first lecture, I talked about the syllabus. I provided you all the details regarding the course procedures, attendance, whether it is your different grading aspects, and the list of readings. And then I talked about the task 1, which I sent you the email of the link, of course, and you have completed the task. Once I have some information or some conclusions from this first survey, I will share what I can with you. It's going to take a few more days, I think. If you have any kind of questions related to all the topics that we talk about, again, it's not less relevant now. It's going to be relevant starting from Thursday. You are more than welcome to email me or to, of course, join me on office hours, which are detailed on your syllabus. All right, so let's start with our topics. Our first topic for this week, we're talking in general about theory construction. What are the basics for constructing a theory? For the topic for today, we begin with a general discussion or an introduction into the basics of theories. Questions such as, what are theories? What are the main components of theories, or how do we judge a theory? I will address all those questions, providing you many, many different details and provide you different explanations and examples that relate to our topic of discussion, which is international relations. So the first question that comes to mind is, why do we even need theories? Now, if we want to explain or to understand different events that happened in the past or that are happening now, we may think about ways to understand those events. For example, let's think about some questions that relate directly to our issues in this class. For example, why did the First World War happen or begin? What led to the establishment of an international organization such as NATO or the UN? Why did a large state like the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan right back in the late 1970s? So all those events happened in the past, and we want to try and understand and learn from them. So one way we can address those kinds of questions may be using events that happen, learning from the past. So World War I, we can look about wars that started beforehand. But we cannot, when we try to understand some of the events that are happening now or something that happened in the past, we don't necessarily can only rely on those past events to explain what we think happening now or what we may think that's going to happen in the future, right? Because if we look at historical events, those are consisting in many cases of different facts. And facts are a crucial part of any explanation. If you want to explain, for example, why did World War I begin, there are different sets of facts that can help us explain that. But this is just part of the explanation. Facts cannot by themselves explain why did World War I begin. What facts provide us is that they provide us evidence for our explanation. Our explanation is going to be some form of theoretical explanation that offers reasons for those events and consists of very clear components. So that's the main limitations of using facts in order to explain. They can provide evidence for our more theoretical explanation. They cannot explain the events by themselves. And facts, so that's the limitation of facts. Now, one way that we can distinguish between using history to explain events to using theory is that history will provide us a descriptive explanation to past events, just tell us what happened. Theory will also provide us with prospective explanations to much larger classes of events that happen in the past or events that may happen in the future. So we can use theory to explain not just World War I, we can explain with theory different classes of wars, large wars, insurgency wars, the establishment of international organizations, trades between different types of states. So theory provides us an explanation to a larger classes of events. Now, what theory offers all us is also can provide us with projections to those kinds of events in the future. What's the likelihood of another insurgency war in the next 15 years based on a series of conditions? That's what theory provides us, and history cannot provide us this part. So that's one of the main examples. One of the main differences, theory provides us explanations regarding to the past, to the present, and to the future. Things that history cannot allow us, that facts by themselves cannot provide us. Now, you may think about the fact that who actually wants to use theory? Another question, who is using theories? Is it just for academics? Now, one person that can maybe helps us answer the question, it's a very smart person, or maybe, we can use Oprah's example. Everybody uses theory. Academics use theory. I use theory in my work. You as a long-suffering student has to use theory in your own studies, in your own different kind of work. But you also want to think about other people that are using theory, such as policymakers, right? Policymakers are the ones who are making decisions, what we call in the real world, and they need theories as well. Why? Because policymakers need to make decisions based on a very uncertain reality, in which they lack all the facts. Policymakers have access with much more accurate type of information than we have in many cases, but it's still an uncertain reality because they don't have all the information. Based on the different types of explanations that they have, which are in essence different types of theories that they have to understand the situation that they face. So what those policymakers are doing, that they use the information that they do have in order to assess those different explanations, to assess those different theories, and test which one best fits to the reality. So what we actually see here, that policymakers also use theory in a very, very high capacity. Now, let's think about an example for that. Our example is going to be from our own area of this class. That's going to be, just a second, there it is. Let's talk about the Iranian nuclear program. as an event that happened in the past, that's happening now, and we want to understand it using theory. Also, we can think about it from the standpoint of policymakers. How do policymakers understand the Iranian nuclear program? So first of all, the main question, we have known that Iran has been developing nuclear technology for about 25 to 30 years now. The question that we ask here, is this technology intended for use by as a military weapons, or is it civilian type of technology using for generating more energy? So let's begin with what we already know, the facts that we already know. As I said, facts are part of the explanation, they're not the explanation itself. What do we know? We know that Iran has built a secret, most of them underground nuclear facilities for nuclear research for some time now. We know they have developed thousands of centrifuge, which is again an essential component in developing this kind of technology, that Iran has been enriching uranium for a long time now. At the same time, we also know that the Iranian religious leader has declared a fatwa. A fatwa is a religious decree which rejects the use of nuclear weapons. So that's another fact that we are familiar with. Right? Now, based on these facts, we can also think about some potential explanation. This is some potential theories to explain the question, why do Iran develops nuclear technology? So one explanation can argue that if we assume that the Iranian leaders are mostly interested in preserving their own power in their own region in the Middle East, then the development of nuclear weapon is critical for either expanding their own deterrent power or preserving their own power in their area versus what they see as their most important rivals in this case, which is the United States and Israel. So in order to secure their regime in the Middle East, they want to develop nuclear technology in order to project more power externally. So that's one potential explanation. We can take another explanation focusing on religious beliefs, saying that if we assume that the leaders of Iran believe that heaven awaits to those that are martyred themselves in order to sacrifice for their own religion, then we can understand that they will develop nuclear technology in order to use that against their enemies, such as Israel for that matter. So by destroying Israel, becoming martyrs, they will follow their own religious faith. And that's can be one explanation to why they will develop nuclear technology and will use that in a military sense. At the same time, we can also say that Iran is interested in developing civilian nuclear energy in order to supplant its depleting energy shortages. They have energy shortages, especially since most of their existing energy resources are being exported in order to support the Iranian economy. So they want to develop nuclear energy in order to supplant those energy sources. Those are all three different potential explanations for why Iran will develop nuclear technology. What policymakers, or even us as researchers, but let's think about it from the policymaker standpoint, they will rely on information. In this context, this is information that they will get from their intelligence or the national security agencies in order to test those and maybe others' theories, identify which one is most consistent with the facts that they have, the facts that I've talked about, and potentially additional facts that they get from the information. So for example, if we are able to identify evidence that Iran is testing what's called nuclear bomb trigger, which is an essential component for creating a small nuclear explosion, then that's going to be evidence that fits with the theory of Iran developing nuclear weapons for military use as a deterrent threat within the region. At the same time, this will also contradict the theory of developing civilian nuclear energy that I also provided here. So the evidence is going to allow us to think about which one of those theories fits better to our case. Essentially, what we're doing here is that we use a very structured set of rules, which are these scientific rules, in order to assess competing explanation. In this case, I provided you with three different explanations for the topic we talked about, and we use the existing evidence in order to compare those explanations. And this is a very important first step in understanding reality. The way that we do that when we use those scientific rules is we do this, we're using a very structured set of rules that's going to make this our analysis of international affairs in this case, or any kind of case, much more organized and fitting with some kind of structure. Okay, so now we know that theories are used by people, not just by academics, they're used by all kinds of people. We even talk about this Iranian nuclear technology example to how do we actually use theories along with the evidence that we have. I want to take now I want to take a step back and go over some definition and some of the important building blocks of a theory. So the definition of theory in this case is, this is a simplified representation of reality intended to explain some empirical events, some empirical phenomena. For example, what are the conditions that leads to the breakout of a preventative war? What are the conditions that encourage economic growth? Or what are the conditions that prevent economic growth? Those are kinds of empirical events that we are trying to explain using theory. These kind of questions that we want to address using a theory fit with our own context of social science. So this is a category of cases, category of events. For that example, all preventative wars. We want to explain the conditions for all preventative wars. But the logic or the definition of a theory based on what I just provided to you also fits with theories beyond the social context. So theory in the natural science also follow these kinds of definitions and are used in the same way. For example, we're scientists in the physics area trying to identify the conditions that explain what governs the motion of stars, what governs the motion of planets, or what leads to changes in weather patterns. The objective of those kinds of theories overall in the natural sciences, what we try to do also in the social science, is to build what's called a deductive theory, which is a general theory which offers very general explanations to multiple classes of events, and then we can actually apply that theory to different specific events. So we want to provide, again, coming back to the example of preventative war, we want to build a theory that provide us an understanding of what are the conditions that lead to preventative war. Again, this is a very general way to look at the class of events, general preventative war, right? And we can apply that theory, and that's the deductive logic. We apply the theory from the general class of preventative wars into specific preventative wars. We look at one preventative war, for example, the war in 1967 between Israel and its Arab neighbors, in many cases was seen as a preventative war. So can we use the theory, if we build a deductive general theory of preventative war, can we apply that to that specific case? That's the goal. All right, so there are three components, fundamental components to any theory. The first is the theory is built on assumptions, then the theory has to follow some form of a logic, and then the theory will have to provide us with some prediction to the future. As I remind you again what I said early on, one of the main differences between a theory and history in this case, that theory is providing us with projection or predictions for how this event that we're talking about might also happen in the future. But I want to focus on assumptions, as they are a critical building block in this case. So assumptions are the foundations of a theory. They are a set of simplifying conditions under which the theory is expected to explain the issue that we're talking about, the issue at stake, as well as offer future predictions. So based on the assumptions, we can devise a theory that explains some event that we want to talk about, also will provide us with future predictions for those similar events to happen in the future. Those assumptions needs to be fit together based on some form of logic, and they will help us derive those predictions, which are our hypotheses. Our hypotheses represent the theory's explanation to the reality that is being studied. Now, the selection of an assumption is a very critical stage in the formation of a theory. And why is that? Because scholars will select the assumptions that they think represents the reality the best for them. But what may happen is that we can think about different theories, right? Because they may be built on different assumptions, and they will explain the same phenomena. Let me give you an example to make this a little bit more, to make it a little bit more logical. So I want to talk about one type of event, one type of phenomena, and multiple theories that explain that, and what are the differences in this case. So one theory that we're going to talk about, actually starting to talk about next week, is called neorealism. Neorealism is a theory, and one of its main assumptions is the states are what's called unitary actors. What does that mean? Is that even though if there are internal conflicts between a different decision maker, for example, between the president and the Secretary of State or the Secretary of Defense or the head of the FBI or the director of the CIA or the head of the Joint Chiefs, if there are any kind of conflicts of opinion between those decision makers, those conflicts are never influencing the way that the states behave in the international system. So according to neorealism, states are behaving based, they're representing one actor. So there's no place for those conflict of opinion. Another theory is the bureaucratic theory, which drives foreign policy. According to that theory, one of the central assumptions is that actions of the state in the international scale are based on the internal dynamics and the potential conflicts between actors. And those actors are representative of different bureaucracies which try to promote their own goal. As a side note, one of the reasons that those different bureaucracies, for that matter, that can be the Joint Chiefs, that can be any kind of defense agencies such as the CIA, the FBI, or other kinds of agencies, the reason that they're trying to promote their own missions is in order to ensure their own survival. But this is a different question. Regardless, the difference between the bureaucratic theory and the neorealism in the context of our discussion is the bureaucratic theory accepts the assumption that there are internal conflicts between different actors within the system and within the state, and that's going to affect the way that the country behaves in the international system. So the bureaucratic theory rejects the unitary actor assumption. So that's two different theories based on very different assumptions, because the scholars that devised those theories chose different assumptions to represent reality. Now, if we want to take as an example a historical or a phenomenon, let's take, for example, military spending. Because military spending is one indicator for the way that states behave in international spending that potentially represents aggressive behavior or maybe going to war. So how can each one of those two theories and their assumption help us understand that? So if we follow our second theory, in this case, the bureaucratic theory, that's going to say that the level of military expansion or the level of military spending is a function of the internal conflicts between different leaders or different agencies that try to manipulate the perception of the security threat in this case in order to increase their own defense budget. So it could be that the Joint Chiefs is going to promote one kind of perception regarding national security in order to get more money to her or his agency, versus the head of the CIA who's going to promote a slightly similar perception of national security reality. So in that case, military spending is going to be based on those kinds of interactions between different internal actors, and that's going to affect the level of military spending. That's based on the bureaucratic theory, based on its assumption, and based on the theory itself. At the same time, a neorealist theory is going to reject that view in favor of a much more unitary perception of the threat. So all actors within the state, whether it is the defense establishment, whether it is the State Department, whether it is the president, national security advisor, whatever that is, they're going to have the same perception of the threat, the same interest they're trying to promote, and therefore there's going to be some form of set required sum of military spending that needed to be accepted in order to enhance security. So again, this is two different approaches to answer the question, how can we explain military spending? That's why the selection of assumption is very, very important. When scholars select their assumptions, they also think about how exactly is the selection of these assumptions, which guide their own construction of the theory, is going to limit the circumstances or the domains that their theory can address. Because if I'm using assumptions that view the behavior of the states only based on a unitary actor assumption, I cannot address with my theory cases that involve a lot of internal conflicts, internal dynamics, because it just doesn't fit. So that's one restriction I have to take under consideration. Okay, so we will study many theories in this course, but to make theories valid, we must be able to test them in empirical, so using data to provide, using evidence to test our theories. And for that, I want to link the discussion that I've had so far with some aspects that are more fitting to the testing category. So there's many elements for testing theory. From an empirical standpoint, theories represent relationship between variables. What are variables? Are events or characteristics that can have multiple values. So variables can have a lot of values. For example, one variable may be the extent, like I just talked about, of military spending. So it can go from one number to another number. So there's a lot of values. Variable can also have, for example, two values. We can think about the binary variable, which says whether a state is a democracy or a non-democracy. So there's two variables in this case. So that's one thing. Constants are events which have a single value. Not too complicated in this case. The dependent variable is what we want to explain. If we want to explain, coming back again to the example that I just gave you, military spending, then that's going to be a dependent variable, the extent of military spending. Whether it is by state, whether it is by a class of states, that depends on or what's called our scope conditions. What are we exactly trying to measure? The independent variables are the different factors we use in order to explain the variation in our dependent variable. So if our dependent variable is military spending, that there's high values or low values, the independent variable is going to help us explain why there's high values under some circumstances and why there are low values under different circumstances. What we're trying to establish when we build a theory is a causal relationship between the dependent variable and the independent variable. So we derive expectations in our theory by linking those dependent variable and independent variable in a series of logically connected arguments. Those expectations, also called hypotheses or propositions, describe some form of relationship between the independent variable and independent variable. So some values or some way that the independent variables behave are going to lead to some kind of values in our dependent variables. So that's what hypotheses are trying to test. So a hypothesis in this case, that's what I said in this example, are predicting the value of the dependent variable, both in the past, so we can think about events that happen and trying to use our hypothesis to see what is the likelihood that war is happening and using evidence to test that. And we can also use those kinds of prediction to the future. What's the likelihood that a war is going to happen in the future? Let me give you an example so we can talk about and illustrate this part of the discussion. How do we actually identify those elements and we test the theories? So how can we explain the relationship between arms races and war? How does greater expenditure on military technology in order to develop more types of weapons, more arms, will lead to war? All right, so the main dependent variable, if we want to study arms race theory, is what is the likelihood that some country is going to enter a war. We want to not explain what is the likelihood that the United States is going to enter a war. We want to provide a much more general explanation, which means we have to account for multiple countries rather than a specific one. So we ask, what is the likelihood that a certain country is going to go into a war? According to the arms race theory, some of the common independent variable in this case, one is the magnitude of the threat. How much does the country that we're studying views threat from its adversary? One way that is being measured in terms of the data is the extent of arm expenditure, military spending that I just talked about. So the more a country spends on the military, it may seem to me, if one of my neighbors is all of a sudden starting to expend much more on its military, that might represent a threat to me. So my threat perception is much higher. That can be one potential independent variable that explains my likelihood of entering a war. Another accepted independent variable is what's called the gun versus butter ratio. This is the relationship between the domestic demand for consumer goods and public services versus defense expenditure. So if a state spends much more on its defense structure compared to its domestic economy, that might represent, again, an arms race, and that may increase the likelihood of going into the war. Now, based on those two different independent variables, one potential proposition or hypothesis that has been developed in studies in the past. And for example, this is this Richardson 1949 paper, says that increases in the magnitude of the threat combined with decreases in demand for consumer goods compared to expenditure on defense, all the combination of those two factors, of those two independent variables, increase the likelihood of war. Okay, so here we use two accepted independent variables, which represent some form of behavior that the state is going through, in order to explain our outcome in this case. What's the likelihood that this country is going to go into the war? Those independent variables are related, of course, to the topic of arms races and national security. I want to mention a few last points about the construction of theories in this case. This guy also had a theory. And what we try to do is, just like Professor Einstein in this case, to build general theory. What Einstein presented to us was what's called the general theory of relativity, which allows us to explain a lot more cases related to the way that our universe behaves, and a lot of the events related to the universe. But in many cases, it's very, very hard. As I just gave you some of those examples, devising a theory of war is very, very hard, but we have to account for a lot of different types of war. We have to account for wars between two large states. We have to account for insurgency wars. We have to account for proxy wars. We have to account for civil wars. So that's all the things we have to account for. This is actually not all. This is many of the things we have to account for if we want to build a general theory of war. So it's very, very hard to build this kind of theory because of an additional principle, which I'm just gonna talk about in a few minutes. So what happens in reality, we have to settle for what's called middle range theories. Middle range theories offer plausible explanations for a certain class or cluster of events. So I want to build a theory that explains proxy wars. I want to build a theory that explains the establishment of international organizations. I'm not looking for a theory that is going to explain everything, which means, just like we always think about the fact that many of the natural sciences, physics, biology, all those cases are very, very hard, social science is also very, very hard. And the additional principles that makes those our desire to build large-scale general theories even harder is that we want to follow what's called the principle of parsimony. When we construct a theory, we try to build an explanation. It's going to cover as many cases as possible, but with minimum set of assumptions. I've already talked about assumptions, and we can see from the discussion about assumptions that in many cases they can be very limiting because they represent reality in some form. They don't represent everything related to reality. So I want to use a limited set of assumptions to cover as many cases as possible. This is the idea behind parsimony. We want to provide a relatively simple explanation that's going to cover as many cases as possible. And again, that comes back to the question of how can we even derive a theory that's going to be simple but explain all types of wars? It's very, very hard because there's a lot of types, whether it is nuclear war, short war, long war, low-cost war, bilateral war, trade war. This is just a different kind of example. So if we want to derive a general theory of war, it has to be simple enough, but it also has to account for all those cases, which makes it very, very hard and brings me back to the first point on this slide, that what we usually eventually come up with is what's called middle range theories. Okay, I'm stopping now, as I promised to remind you more than once about your attendance word. So today I made it a lot clearer, and I'm going to provide you with the attendance word for today. The attendance word is distance. Distance is the attendance word. After you're done watching this lecture, you're more than welcome to go into the Google form and submit the attendance word for today. It's not going to be that obvious from in the following lectures, not because I want you to miss those attendance words for sure, just because I don't want to spend too much time on that. So just make sure that you're following that for the rest of the lecture. All right, so we have learned about the different aspects of how to construct a theory, or what are the main aspects that we must think about when we build a theory. And I want to move ahead to the next phase, which is how do we evaluate a theory? So overall, our evaluation criteria is based on three elements. First is evidence, whether we have evidence that supports or contradicts our theory. I'm going to talk about both of them in a few minutes. The second, there has to be logical consistency, both for the theory itself as well as between the different theories, among the theory's assumption. And lastly, we need to provide evidence that shows that our theory, our explanation, outperforms alternative explanations, or it may not. But those are different criteria that we use to evaluate a theory. The first point of evidence to support or contradict our theory is pretty straightforward. If we have no evidence to support or contradict our theory, then it's not very useful. As an example, so there's a theory that links between territorial disputes over territory, and the likelihood of war. So according to that theory, whenever the dispute between two countries or more than two countries involve issues related to territory, the likelihood of war is higher. The evidence in this case, there's evidence that shows that the vast majority, whenever the dispute between two actors or more than that revolves around the territory, the likelihood of war is much higher. And the evidence supports that. So in this case, what we have is actually, we are answering the first criteria. In this case, we have data, we have evidence that supports our prediction, supports our theory. So that's already good in order for the way that we judge our theory. Okay, the second point is what's called logical consistency. Logical consistency means the theory must clearly describe how one set of factors lead or causes another set of factors. So in this case, how do our set of factors, our independent variable, lead to certain outcomes in the dependent variable? Another thing that must be fitting according to logical consistency is that the assumptions cannot contradict one another. Because if the assumptions cannot contradict one another, then we may be confused first about explaining the specific phenomenon we're trying to explain now, what happened in the past and what's happening in the present. It also makes it very hard to predict future events, again, because the assumptions are contradicting one another. Let's think about an example. The example is going to be a theory we're going to talk about next week, one of the fundamental theories of IR, which is what's called realism, developed in the late 1940s. One of the central assumptions of realism is the focus on power. States are pursuing to expand their own power in order to survive, and that explains their behavior toward each other. At the same time, the theory of realism has an internal contradiction. That is because, according to the theory of realism, some of the states in the international system are what's called status quo states. Status quo states are states that are content with the current situation and do not pursue more power. So that means that on the one hand, we have states that seek to expand their power at any cost. At the same time, there are states that are accepting the status quo. So how can we make a prediction if states are either on that class of states or on that class of states? How can we make this kind of prediction? One thing we can do is we can focus on one side of those conditions. For example, we can think about the assumption of power as an important factor in the international system. And we can predict that an imperialist nation, a nation that seeks to expand its power, will act in ways that's going to challenge the distribution of power. It's going to challenge the existing status quo. They're trying to get much more power over their side of the equation as much as possible. The problem is that this kind of prediction does not meet the other type of states that we have in the system according to the realist theory, which is the status quo state, because status quo states do not try to change the distribution of power. They accept the current distribution of power. So because assumptions are one of the important foundations of any theory, these are very challenging and significant problems. In the case of realism, it raises a lot of issues regarding to how much can we apply that specific theory to reality. In the context of social sciences, the idea of logical consistency is very complicated, mostly because there can be multiple cases, different types of states, for example, that we're trying to test, and all of them had to follow the same set of assumptions. So it's very hard in this case to make sure that our explanation is logical. A related factor to logical consistency, what's called the principles of falsifiability. When we test a theory, we should be able to identify and state the conditions under which the prediction of our theory are actually wrong. If we cannot identify such conditions, then we cannot what's called falsify the theory, and then we question its scientific fit. This is one of the most important principles of scientific theories, our ability to falsify them and to find the condition, the specific set of conditions according in which the prediction of the theory do not materialize. As an example, to make it more logical and to make it makes more sense, let's think about religious beliefs. When we think about a religious belief, we cannot specify the conditions under which there is a God or there isn't a God, right? There may be some conditions that tell us that there is a God, there may be some conditions that tell us there is a God, but we cannot find the same set of conditions that show us that our predictions, according to religious theory, if we want to call that, is wrong. As a result, a religion is not a theory, it's a belief, because whatever the conditions are, they can lead to the actions that there is a God or there isn't a God. So in this case, we cannot find a condition showing that there is not a God or something of a similar question. That means that religious beliefs are just what they are, beliefs and not a theory. Now, a little bit more relevant example to our discussion, let's talk about research on terrorism and the extent of lethality, how lethal are groups, how many casualties are groups able to create. And one of the questions in this research is whether it is a function of cooperation between groups or competition. So I'll explain it now a little bit more in detail. There's some cluster of studies that suggest that the more competition that there is between groups, it means that there's less cooperation between them. It leads to those groups taking more risky actions, again, in order to ensure their own survival in this competitive environment, which leads at the end to more victims. So one set of studies in the terror groups lethality research argue that more competition between groups leads to more victims. However, there is a competing explanations arguing that the more cooperation that there is between groups, there's actually more victims. Why is that? Mostly because when groups are able to cooperate with one another, they can share some of their techniques, some of their resources, share their capabilities, and as a result, to create more casualties. The result of those two sets of explanation is that we have two competing explanations, both of them leading to the same outcomes, more victims. Now, whether we find evidence that shows that more competition leads to more casualties, or actually more cooperation leads to more casualties, we cannot falsify the theory. That's the problem that we have in this case. Now, you may ask, okay, so why is there research on terror group cooperation competition if there's not a theory? Well, one thing that we can do in order to solve this problem is that we're looking at a smaller cluster of cases. We look at lower levels of analysis to unpack our cases of inquiry. One example is a study from 2014, which identified the conditions that explain how cooperation actually lead to more casualties. Those are very specific conditions that lead to these outcomes. And without meeting those conditions, which again are lower levels than the more general explanations about cooperation or competition, without meeting those conditions, we are not likely to see the outcomes of more casualties. So this is a partial solution to this problem. And again, it comes back to the topics of general theory and middle range theory, but it does not solve the problem altogether. The final point in the assessment or the evaluation of theories is, there it is testing competing explanation and testing whether the theory that we want to propose will outperform other theories. We begin with what's called the first principle of wind walking. According to this principle, a theory will prevail, an existing theory will prevail as long as it outperforms other theories. So only if a more accurate explanation will emerge, then it is likely to supplant the existing theory, which sounds pretty simple, right? But in reality, it's not that simple because the switch is not easy to implement. We need to accumulate a large volume of evidence for the alternative explanation to show that this new alternative explanation is actually better than the existing one. And the reason that it's a very complicated one is because it involves what's called switching costs. those switching costs are coming into play when we evaluate those competing explanations. And whenever we evaluate different explanations to an existing, to some phenomena we're trying to explain, we consider the cost and the risks that are associated with the change, with accepting a different explanation to this theory. When those switching involves very high cost, then the probability of making the change, of accepting any kind of an alternative explanation to the issue that we're talking about right now, is much lower. We're less likely to accept those competing explanations when the switching costs are very, very high. Now, this principle explains a lot of why a lot of the behavior in international relations is very, very predictable, because giving up on our beliefs, on our existing theories in that matter, is very costly. So we will reject any kind of alternative explanations as a way of behavior. Let's look at an example for that to make it a little bit more, again, to make it a little bit more real for us. Within the field of counterterrorism, studies have shown that the most powerful, the potential most powerful tool against radicalization is to persuade those radicals, those perpetrators of terrorism, that there are other ways to accomplish their goals or make true for their beliefs. Now, if we think about those radical individuals, when their beliefs about why they are engaging in violence and terrorism are ingrained in religion or any kind of years of discrimination, whatever that discrimination that may it be political, economic, social, whatever that discrimination is, then it's very, very hard for them to change those beliefs and adopt a new explanation in this case, that if they will behave in a different way, they will still be able to accomplish their goals, even without engaging in violence. The end result of that is that very few radicals are turning back based on the use of persuasion. But when they do, actually, it's one of the most effective methods that there are. This idea of the principle of wind walking and the difficulty to change your theories or change your beliefs in that matter because of those high costs is also prevalent among policymakers. There's a lot of examples of leaders that tend to hold on to their existing theories that explain events in the international scale or in the domestic arena for much too long, because the costs for them are very, very high. And as a result, their behavior is very, very predictable. And in some cases, this is a lot less efficient in terms of what their goal is to help the public. Now, I want to give you another example of the difficulty to change existing ideas in our context of international relations, and that's what's called President Reagan SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative, also called Star Wars. This was a defense program back in the 1980s. It was intended to use technology in space in order to defend the United States against the threats of nuclear attacks from the Soviet Union. So the idea behind the SDI in this case is that it provides active defense rather than what was accepted back in the days, what was the common strategy between the United States and the Soviet Union, what was called the MAD strategy. MAD is an acronym from Mutual Assured Destruction. The idea that has existed since early in the Cold War is that why are there no use of nuclear weapons between the two superpowers is because each one of those two superpowers has the capability to respond even after taking an initial attack. So if the United States decides to shoot its missiles at the Soviet Union and destroy some of its main cities, the Soviets still have the capability to retaliate using nuclear technology or nuclear missiles on airplanes or on submarines or any other kinds of ways to deliver those weapons. So by having this what's called second strike capability, the United States, in this case, has no incentive to make the first strike and attack the Soviet Union with nuclear weapons. That's the idea behind MAD. Each one of those two superpowers has the capability to respond after withstanding a nuclear attack, and that's why there's no incentive to actually make this kind of an attack. Now, SDI is active defense. It's supposed to prevent those attacks, those initial attacks, and in this case, it represents a sharp deviation from this idea of MAD, because instead of having the capability to retaliate after being attacked once, this active defense can prevent that. So the SDI presented a sharp deviation from assured destruction by two nuclear powers. But because again, if one state, if in this case, if the United States decided to fire nuclear missiles against the Soviet Union, by also having this SDI program in play, they can also prevent the Soviets from retaliating after being attacked once. So actually, there's no more nuclear deterrence in this case. And that represented a very, very substantial change from the existing theories of relationship between those two superpowers. So again, if we go back to our discussion about the windwalking principles, the potential risk for both states in this case from the adoption of this program, the SDI, were just too great. Therefore, they were not projected. It was very hard to change the existing explanation or the existing theories of leading policymakers about the relationship and the behavior of those two states in order to lead them to adopt it. Now, there are many other reasons that the SDI program specifically was not accepted, but this is just an example showing how when you present a new idea, a new explanation, in this case, a new program to explain the relationship between two states, it might be too radical, too much in order to accept that, and therefore it was rejected. Now, one last related aspect in this case is that when we assess different, in this case, competing explanations, but when we assess information, we tend to evaluate the cost. We evaluate the cost and the benefits of each one of those alternatives, but we tend to place much greater weight on the cost compared to the benefits. We tend to emphasize the cost of accepting an alternative explanation, and as a result, in many cases, we just prefer to stay in the current state, to stay in the status quo, in order to not suffer the potential cost of adopting a new explanation, an alternative explanation in this case. So these are some of the main principles that we use to judge or to evaluate theories, but we can ask in this question, in this context, how do we actually do that? How do we evaluate those theories? When we want to assess a theoretical explanation, we use evidence, we use cases. It is one of the common ways to evaluate the empirical usefulness of a theory is by presenting one or several cases, what's called case studies. Those cases has to be consistent with the theory's prediction because that's the evidence to support our theory. Case studies usually rely on a single event and they are useful for developing ideas about a certain phenomena or explain a specific event. For example, if we want to study the Vietnam War, that can provide us explanation to this specific case. But it also can provide us ideas about related cases to the Vietnam War. For example, what are the causes for proxy wars? What are some of the explanations for conflicts that happened during the Cold War? Potentially some explanation related to insurgency wars. So what we do is that we use the Vietnam War as a single case following to explain the case itself and also to explain potentially other similar cases. This is what's called the inductive method of research, which means that we try to expand insights from a single case, in this case, for example, the Vietnam War, to a wider class of cases, to proxy wars, to insurgency wars, to conflicts during the Cold War. This is what's called the inductive method. This is the opposite of the deductive method, which I talked about early on, which is another thing we're trying to accomplish when we study the social sciences, is provide a general explanations for one specific class of cases. But if we want to provide stronger support for a theoretical explanation and conduct a more robust test, we need more than a single case. The reason is that the vast majority of social science theories are making probabilistic prediction. We do not predict that the event is for certain it's going to happen. We predict that it's likely to happen. And in order to thoroughly assess such prediction, a single case is usually not enough. It's very hard to say that proxy wars are likely to happen just based on the conditions that happened in the Vietnam War. We need a lot more than that. So what we need is a lot more cases because the prediction is that the outcomes are mixed. Sometimes those outcomes, a proxy war is going to happen, sometimes it's not going to happen. But the more cases we have, the more confident we are in the theory that we propose, in the explanation we propose. If we propose an explanation that the likelihood that proxy wars are going to start, the more cases we have, the more likely it is that we're going to be confident in our explanations. Now, the selection of cases, of relevant cases for our testing of the theory is a very complicated task and is very crucial and when we conduct our research. For example, if we go back to arms races and the likelihood of war, we can select as cases that's going to support our theory World War I and as well as World War II. But at the same time, there's many examples for wars that did not follow an arms race. So we cannot just focus on those cases that support our theory. So there are cases of wars which are, in this case, represent contradictory evidence that arms races are always going to lead to wars. And what that is actually an example for what's called selection bias. Selection bias means when we want to test our theory, we'll only select cases that support our theory. We'll select the ones that only provide are consistent with our theory, but we're going to overlook or we're going to ignore the cases that can refute that theory. What that selection bias means is that if we only select the cases that support our theory, we do not account for the variation in dependent variable. If our dependent variable is the beginning of war based on an arms race, and if we only select cases that support the theory, that support the argument that arms races lead to war, we do not account for variation for cases where arms races did not lead to wars. And that's part of the selection bias, and that's the problem. So that's why when we select cases, we need to select a lot of cases, and we need to ensure that we not follow a selection bias. We do not just select the cases that are consistent with that theory, but we select a larger class of cases. So to summarize, I want to recap our discussion about the construction of theories. International politics consists of many different events happening at the same time. There are many potential explanations for those events, and our challenge is finding the right way to test those competing explanations and find the one that fits the best to our, it offers the most logical explanation to the case that we are studying, and that's where the scientific method comes into play in providing us the tools to follow those rules in order to find the most consistent, logical explanation to our research question. All right, so at the end of each lecture, I'm going to have this kind of slide, which is recommended readings, potentially more studies. If you want to learn more about theory and construction, you can follow those. This is not required readings, it's just recommended ones. You're more than welcome to follow that. I'll remind you again today about the attendance word. I provided the attendance word earlier in the lecture. Now that you are done, you are more than welcome to go into the Google form and submit the attendance word of the day. That's it. If you have any questions, of course, you're more than welcome to join office hours on Tuesdays and Thursdays, or email them to me any questions we have. I'm going to see all of you on Thursday. Have a nice day and stay safe.